All right. First of all, thank you again for inviting me. I'm apologizing for not being able to be there in person. It's just been a bad year health-wise, and I don't want to get into the details, but at least there are no big birds circling my house yet. Um, but I'm plugging away, and again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here via Zoom. And I did recognize a lot of the names that are watching via Zoom, and some of them good friends from the past. And I will do my best for Barb Franco and Andrea Quinn and others who are probably taking notes and grading me as we do this program. Again, this is not a complete program. It can never be a complete program. We'd be here for hours and hours. It's just one that I put together several years ago, and I think it's a lot of the lesser known, better known stories, or vice versa, of women at Gettysburg or involved in the campaign. And I would like to thank Andrea for making a strong suggestion for adding information on one of the individuals that you'll see in slides 41 and 42. Again, like I said, this is not a complete program. It will never be a complete program. We would be here for hours. Well, I hope you enjoy it. I enjoyed putting it together over the years, and as you can see, with Andrea's help, it's a work in progress. And I've done this at several other roundtables in the past, and I've always enjoyed doing this one. So without further ado, a lot of you might recognize some of the faces already, and some of them you may not. And with that, we'll start the program. Okay, everybody probably knows all about this monument and the story behind it and the woman that is depicted in it. It's Elizabeth Thorne, who was 7 months pregnant at the time of the battle. And as the caretaker of the cemetery, her husband was in the Army, so she was holding the fort literally by herself at the cemetery. She had help with her father, and she had several children. And her note and comments are that she had, we kept burying the soldiers until they had the National Cemetery in place. And they buried her, and her father buried 105 soldiers in that kind of heat. Again, she was 7 months pregnant. And 3 months later, she had her dear baby, but it was not, the health failed. And for years, she was very sickly and then passed on. Peter Thorne returned home after Appomattox in 1865, and the family continued as caretakers until 1874. Elizabeth Thorne died in 1907 and is buried in Evergreen Cemetery along with her family. In 2002, a Civil War Women's Memorial was dedicated to honor all the women involved in the campaign, not just her. The sculpture depicts Elizabeth attending to burial duties. As you can see, her face is full of anguish, and an apron covers her pregnant abdomen, and she holds a spade representing all she did. In the base of the monument, if you look carefully, I don't have the slide, there are I think 2 spent mini balls in the monument at the base that Ron Tennyson did. One of those little details. All right, now this is another one you probably all know. French Mary Tepe of the 114th Pennsylvania Infantry. One of the Vivandiers, and that's one heck of a uniform you have there. And the photograph to the right shows her in front of and across from Evergreen Cemetery, actually. That is the photograph that shows you the original photograph that gave you the close-up. Seeing a woman in the midst of a hotly contested Civil War battlefield of Spotsylvania surprised the veteran officer of the 8th Ohio, a woman in a uniform, a Zouave uniform at that. That was the famous Vivandier Marie Tepe, who served with the 114th PA. Vivandiers appeared in European armies, and they provided different services for the units. They attended to the sick, provided other services, probably some sewing, that type of thing, cooking perhaps. And they were known to wear the uniform of the regiment. Over the years, the status of the Vivandiers changed, and some of the women swept into some of the most dangerous parts of the battles. Such courage existed among women in America when the Civil War began, and there were women who were them, like French Mary, who were ready to defend the country along with their fellow husbands and friends. Marie Tepe was one such woman. She was originally born in France, raised by her father, and later moved to the U.S. following his death. When she was nearly 20 years old, she married Bernard Tepe, a Philadelphia tailor. When the war began, her husband joined the 27th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment. And as soon as her husband left, so did Marie, despite Bernard wanting her to stay and mind the tailor shop in Philly. In the spring of 61, Marie Tepe became a Vivandier with the 27th PA Volunteers, her husband's regiment. She's better known as a Vivandier of the 114th PA. The original company of that regiment was organized in the early weeks of August of 1861 by Captain Charles Collis. Then in mid-August of 1862, Collis raised 9 more companies to form the 114th, with himself as the colonel. Marie Tepe, who left the 27th and then joined the 114th, wore a blue jacket, red pants, and to distinguish herself from the men, she wore a skirt trimmed in red. She was often referred to as French Mary and participated in the Battle of Gettysburg. During the battle, she received a bullet wound to the ankle, and for her bravery during that battle, she was awarded the Kearny Cross, which is awarded for valor to members of the 1st Division of the Union Army Corps, with General Phil Kearny in charge. After a short hospitalization, she rejoined the regiment, and in July 63, she was there at Gettysburg with her unit. She volunteered her services as a nurse to help the wounded, and after weeks of tending to the injured, she returned to her regiment. She served throughout the war and later moved to Pittsburgh. All right, now we know these two, Jenny Wade and her sister. Jenny Wade died at the tender age of 20, the only known civilian to have lost her life during the battle. She lived on Breckenridge Street and was at her sister George's residence with her mother, baking bread, as we all know. And as her sister had just given birth, Jenny was a seamstress like her mother. Her mother provided help with the bread and water for the Union soldiers. The morning of her death, Jenny was kneading dough to make for more bread when around 8:30, bullet shots through the door, and one struck Jenny and she was killed instantly. Her sister, born on July 4th, 1841, was born to Mary Ann Philby of nearby York and James Wade, a native Virginian, who by 1845 served with the 10th Company Adams County Militia. She lived on 242 Baltimore Street, where both parents worked at Taylor's, and Mary Ann moved Georgia to Breckenridge Street. At age 14, she began learning the millinery business and continued plying that trade until her marriage in April 62 to John Lewis McClellan, a private in Company E of the 2nd Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment. She moved her house to Baltimore Street, the famous house where her sister was killed. After the war in 1866, Georgia and her husband moved to Iowa to get a fresh start, where she died in 1927. In the town where she moved to, there is a boulder from Devil's Den, which was set up as a monument to honor the soldiers from Gettysburg. So you wonder about, if you're ever in Iowa, What is this boulder from Gettysburg doing there? It's because of Georgia Wade McClellan. Another one you probably know because of the book that she wrote, Tilly Pierce, who lived on Baltimore Street as well. She was 15 years old. She lived near the Shriver house. Beside them, Molly and Sadie Shrivers were their neighborhood friends and playmates. When the fighting was beginning to commence, Molly and Sadie Shriver, their parents took them and Tilly to their relatives at the Jacob Weichert farm to get them out of harm's way. Little did they know that would become a field hospital where they would see horrific scenes, as we all know. The second day, as we all know, was what caused the scenes and the fighting and the memories to be down at the Jacob Weichert farm. She saw her share of the dead and wounded, and she actually saw and gave a drink of spring water to General Meade as he walked up or rode up in front of the house prior to the fighting down there on July 2nd. But she then also did see a lot of the wounded soldiers when they came back from the fighting for Little Round Top. She later wrote a book about all of her firsthand accounts. 2 years after the war, she met a young man who was a student at the Lutheran Seminary, and they were married in 1871, moved to Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania, raised 3 children, and Tilly died in 1914 nearby Philadelphia. That is the book that she wrote, which is still in print. You can buy that at basically any store and online, Amazon.com, what have you. It's very well written, and I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. All right. We all know about the widow Thompson, Lee's headquarters during the battle in Chambersburg Street, just outside of town. That's a picture of her. Her name was Anna Mary Long, originally born in 1793 in Littlestown. Her first husband was Daniel Sell, with whom she had 3 daughters, but he died at the age of 30 in 1822. 4 years later, she married Joshua Thompson, and she would have 2 sons and 3 daughters through him. But he was a drunkard and disappeared somewhere in some time after 1841. Mary had the privilege of knowing Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, and he was the one that helped pay for her property and allowing her to stay in the home that she had been living with her husband. After the disappearance of her husband, she took the money and asked him to purchase the stone house. Although the Stevens' name was on the deed, she owned the home. She cooked and washed laundry at the seminary a short distance away to help support herself. Her children had already moved away by the battlefield. In July, she was 69 years old during the battle, known by the residents simply as the Widow Thompson. As we know, the house General Lee's staff chose as his headquarters was 1.5-story stone house on the 4-acre tract. Again, you've probably all been there before. She died 1873. Now, that's the Leah Leister farm, which we all know is the widows Leister, who General Meade had his headquarters there along the Baltimore Pike. In 1861, Leah Leister, the widow of James Leister, purchased a 9-acre farm along the Tawnytown Road, just south of Gettysburg, moved in with her 6 children. The youngest child was only 3 years old. 2 years later, she was forced out of her home when the battle came right to her doorstep. General Meade took her house for headquarters, which was damaged during the battle. Her children did so well rebuilding the farm, however, that they were able to purchase acres in addition to that, and they built a large 2-story addition to the farmhouse. When the park took over that, they ended up taking the addition down, so you do not see the 2nd story anymore on the property. She sold her farm to the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, moved into the town. She purchased a lot near the Dobbin House on the Emmitsburg Road, and there she moved the 1874 section of her own. After the move, she built a 2-story addition, as we had mentioned. She lived there until her death in 1893 and is buried in Evergreen Cemetery. Now, this is another widow. How many of you know Catherine Hagan? She was also a widow. Her husband had died before the battle, and she lived along the Baltimore Pike just east of Powers Hill. Her daughter had married Joseph Sherfy, who owned a farm where we all know are familiar with the peach orchard With her location and being alone in the home and with Union troops all around her, she decided to get out of harm's way and go to where her in-laws were, the famous peach orchard and the Sherfy farm. Little did she know she'd be walking into the battle as well. An interesting part of that is while she is there during the fighting on July 2nd, she's walking across to get water, I assume, the well or what have you. And as she's walking across the farmyard, a stray mini ball passed through the fence and struck the folds of her skirts. She picked up the ball and kept it as a souvenir. A Union officer soon ordered the Sherpies away on account of the fighting, which they did. The family then reunited with their children behind Union lines. She died in 1864 at the age of 81. There's no picture that I can find so far of Catherine Hagen, but these are her in-laws, Joseph and Mary Sherfy. So technically, I would have to say that Catherine Hagen was perhaps the first souvenir collector of the battle. And during the battle, the American Battlefield Trust purchased the Hagen House 2016, if I recall. They are going to fix it up, but it is not on their priority list at this point. I had checked earlier this year with them and last year as well, just trying to keep an eye on it to see what their plans are. But at this point, it's not on their list, immediate list to get fixed up. The foundation is sagging and it definitely needs work. I hope they move it up on their list. You saw the picture of what it looks like. Josephine Miller, you might or might not know this one. The one-story farmhouse was the home of Peter Rogers, his wife Susan, and their granddaughter Josephine. Single woman, 23 years of age. They stayed behind during the fighting on July 2nd, while Peter and his wife took refuge east of the Round Tops. She kept baking bread for all the Union soldiers. A Union officer told Josephine that he should leave, but she refused. She said she would stay until the bread was done. Sound familiar? After the fighting was over, she remained at the farm caring for the wounded Union and Confederate soldiers. At the reunion after the battle, General Slocum made this statement: the great artillery duel, which shook the earth for miles around, and Pickett's men who charged past her house found her quietly baking her bread and distributing it to the hungry. When the battle was over, her house was found to be riddled with shot and shell, and 17 dead bodies were taken from the house and cellar, the bodies of wounded men who had crawled to the little dwelling for shelter. She died in January 1911. She married one of the Sliders of the Slider farm there near Little Round Top. During the dedication of that monument, the troops wanted her to be in the photograph. So that's her in the foreground. And in addition, they wanted another photograph taken with her in her oven, a separate photo. All right, so we got a lot of the civilians. Let's talk about the female soldiers that we know of. We know about the Vivandiers and such, but there are at least 5 women who fought at Gettysburg, 2 Union soldiers and 3 Confederates. The book Women in the Civil War indicates 2 additional women fought on the side of the Confederacy, but we'll cover what we know for sure. One of the female Union soldiers was a woman from New York, Mary Cecil, but the other was a young teenage girl who still remains unknown to this day. Both women survived the battle, although the young teenager received minor wounds during the fighting. 3 female Confederate soldiers mentioned in They Fought Like Demons also remain unidentified due to the Confederates' poor record keeping. They were not as lucky as one of the women was shot in the leg and captured. She was sent to the military hospital in Chester, Pennsylvania, where doctors amputated her leg. A Union soldier recuperated in the hospital. At the same time, Thomas Reed wrote to his parents about her in August of 1863. I must tell you that we have a female secession. She was wounded at Gettysburg, but her doctors soon found her out. They say she is very good looking, but the poor girl has lost a leg. There's a great pity she did not stay at home with her mother, but she gets good care and kind treatment. I have yet to find out who that soldier was. Maybe someday it'll come out. The other 2 female soldiers, Confederate soldiers mentioned in the book, did not make it off the battlefield alive. They were both mortally wounded during Pickett's charge. One of the women died while storming the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge, and the other died later on the field. A male Union soldier guarding the Emmitsburg Road that evening heard the women's cries of agony as she lay dying on the field and described it as the most awful sound he had ever heard. Their bodies were later discovered by a Union burial detail as the Confederates had retreated and left their dead and wounded. According to the book Women in the Civil War, two Confederate women soldiers named Mary and Molly Bell also served under General Jube Early at Gettysburg, as well as at Chancellorsville and Spotsylvania Courthouse, until their true identities were discovered. And then they were sent to a Confederate prison before being released when their combat exploits were confirmed, and they had not simply been camp followers. Mary was 15 and Molly was 22, were from Pulaski County, Virginia, and they had enlisted in the Confederate Army under false identities. Mary enlisted as Tom Parker, and Molly enlisted as Bob Morgan or Bob Martin. However, it has still not been confirmed that they were at Gettysburg, but very likely. Another, we'll call him a Vivandier, but at least there's some similarities. Anna Etheridge from Michigan, born in 1839. She was reared in luxury, but her father met with misfortune with his business ventures. She married James Etheridge and enlisted in the 2nd Michigan, where she joined as a nurse and Vivandier, as I mentioned, transferring to the 3rd and 5th Michigan Infantry Regiments so that she could stay with the Army of the Potomac. They called her Michigan Annie. She was often found on the front lines, taking care of the wounded, where most surgeons wouldn't dare venture. She packed 2 pistols and rode a horse that hauled saddlebags filled with medical supplies. She served at battles of 1st and 2nd Bull Run, Williamsburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. During one battle, when victory appeared hopeless, she shouted words of encouragement that inspired the men to fight on and win. One soldier later recounted, all the officers in the Army of the Potomac would not have had as much influence over the men as did Annie. On May 27, 1963, Annie was awarded the Kearny Cross, just like the other individual we mentioned earlier. A Union Combat Decoration awarded to soldiers for overwhelming bravery. Medal of Honor recipient Brevet Major General Claire Mulholland recalled observing Annie during the 2nd day of the battle at Gettysburg during the fighting around the peach orchard. Amidst cannon shot that was throwing up loose dirt around the farm, a woman on horseback and in uniform galloped back from the front of the line, asked for information, and quickly returned to the front again. She was a nurse, Anna Etheridge, and was directing the removal of the wounded. She was self-possessed and did not seem to mind the fire. She went on to serve in many more battles. She had her pension papers where it mentions she was camped near Jeffersonville, Indiana, July 5th, 1865, where she was presented with an official copy of the battle she had participated in. She later married after the war Charles Hooks, a veteran of the 7th Connecticut Infantry Regiment, and moved to D.C., where she obtained a job at the Treasury Department. She died in 1913 and is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Here's one you may not know. Mrs. Sophronia Buckland. She wanted to be a nurse. She offered herself to serve with Dorothea Dix, superintendent of nurses. Dorothea Dix first refused her offer to become a nurse because of her age and feared the work would be too hard for her. Buckland was stubborn and refused to take no for an answer. She arrived in D.C., and because of the great need for nurses, they put her to work. She was one of the first women nurses to arrive at Gettysburg. She found wounded soldiers lying in the streets and feared walking on them, and she remembered they were lying like trees uprooted by a tornado. She was directed to nurse those in the field outside the hospital. She wrote that she was thankful that I had been sent to aid, even though she faced a line of stretchers 1.5 miles long. She washed agonized faces, combed matted hair, and bandaged slight wounds. She administered drinks to the injured, raspberry vinegar and lemon syrup. Hospital beds were set in rows, and she gave up her own mattress for one of the wounded. She was startled that there were Confederate soldiers among the wounded. She did not always approve of them, but she insisted that they were all nursed equally, whatever my hands were found to do, despite her own hunger, swollen feet, and wearied limbs. She praised the kindly doctors that she encountered for all the work that they had done. She nursed through the summer and into the fall and was familiar with all the death and despair in every shape that you can imagine. One soldier reported that she would recommend her for a pension. She'd done more for any one man in the rebellion. She left an account of the newly opened National Cemetery, and she was there the day the cemetery was dedicated. She moved back to Washington, D.C., and remained a nurse until the end of the war. She died in Ithaca, New York in 1902. Now, this is one you probably know. Cornelia Hancock. She had embarked on a mission of mercy as well. She came to the battlefield to accompany her brother, Henry Child. They had made their way through Baltimore train station, where Mrs. Hancock and other female volunteers who wanted to become nurses encountered Dorothea Dix, as we just found out from the prior slides, the superintendent of the nurses. They had strict standards for the female nurses, insisting that they be mature in years, at least 30, plain, almost to homeliness in dress, and be literally endowed with we'll let that go. In her memoir, Hancock described the encounter with Dix. She looked the nurses over and pronounced them all suitable except me, and objected to my going farther on the score of my youth, as I was just 23 years of age. In those days, it was considered indecorous for angels of mercy to appear otherwise than gray-haired and spectacled. Such a thing as a hospital corps of comely young maiden nurses possessing grace and good looks was then unknown. A colleague challenged Dix on Hancock's behalf, but the young women didn't wait to hear the argument's outcome. The discussion waxed warm, and I had no idea what the conclusion they came to, for I settled the question myself by getting on the car and staying in my seat until the train pulled out of the city of Baltimore. They had not forcibly taken this from a seat, and I got into Gettysburg on July 6th, where the need was so great, where no further argument about the age was brought up. She served as a nurse and other capacities until the end of the war, and used her funds from the Philadelphia Quakers and the Freedmen's Bureau to establish a school for Negroes in South Carolina, where she taught for 10 years. Then moved to Philadelphia and then helped found the Children's Aid Society. She died in Atlantic City. Georgiana Woolsey, another woman that took care of the wounded. My brother is on General Meade's staff. She was asking a wounded rebel soldier as she was attending him. She said, "Do you have someone in the Army?" She said, "Yes, I have a brother on General Meade's staff." You can always tell, he said, when people are good to soldiers because they have friends in the Army. As nurses at Gettysburg, Woolsey and others worked for 3 weeks near the railroad depot, feeding and caring for the wounded as they were transferred to hospitals in Baltimore, Harrisburg, York, and other areas. She wrote a pamphlet about her experiences for the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which distributed over 10,000 copies. After the war, she married and moved to New Haven, Connecticut, where she founded the Connecticut Training School for Nurses. She died in New Haven, Connecticut in 1906. Okay, now there were Confederate nurses. There are two that we have records that I could find, and perhaps Barb has some other information as well. But here are two that we know of. Lucinda Horn, born in 1814, Edgefield County, South Carolina. She accompanied her husband and son to war. She served as a regimental cook and laundress in Company K of the 14th South Carolina Infantry, which was in the fighting with A.P. Hill's division. She survived the war, although both of her husband and son sustained wounds. They survived. They returned home to South Carolina. And unfortunately, because of the war, and it is reported that Lucinda and her husband went on to become peddlers selling pottery. That was the best that they could do. She died in 1896. Another nurse that we know of is Rose Quinn, Company K of the 15th Louisiana Infantry at Gettysburg and Nichols Brigade, Allegheny Johnson's division, and Ewell's Second Corps. She served from 61 through the end of the war. There are reports of her on the field under fire at the Battle of First Bull Run and at Gettysburg, but I haven't seen any specific ones. When some of the men in her regiment were briefly imprisoned after Appomattox, she insisted on joining them. After the war, she became the matron of a soldier's home in New Orleans. There's her grave. All right, you might know this one. Lydia Hamilton Smith was the longtime housekeeper, Thaddeus Stevens in Gettysburg. They had the house and office as attorney's office on Chambersburg Street. She's born at Russell Tavern near Gettysburg. There is if I recall, there is a plaque, historical marker there. I believe I saw it once years ago when I was driving on another matter. She married a free black man, Jacob Smith, who died, after whom she had 2 sons. After the Battle of Gettysburg, she borrowed a horse and wagon and went through Adams County, telling people of the thousands of wounded men, and rounded up donations of food and clothing for the wounded. And then when they used all of that up that she rounded up, she spent her own money to do so and resupplied the wagon as much as they could. And they did give the food, clothing, and delicacies to both Union and Confederate soldiers alike for weeks. And you probably do know about the Daughters of Charity coming up after the fighting from Emmitsburg, from the South. They came and they were everywhere. They were feeding anyone and everyone that they could find. They were located primarily at the Brick House on Tollgate Hill. They moved north with the head of the Daughters of Charity, Francis Burlando, the director, and he wrote, on July 1st, the battle commenced about 9 miles from Emmitsburg. 200,000 men were in the field, on each side from 100 to 130 pieces of cannon. The Army of the South was defeated and in their retreat left their dead and wounded on the battlefield. What number of victims perished during this bloody engagement? No one knows yet, but it is estimated that the figures rise to 50,000. On Sunday, the day after the battle, several sisters and Father Burlando set out for Gettysburg. They started to take care of all the wounded they could find. They moved to the churches, the hotels, homes, wherever they could find locations to assist. Next day, more sisters arrived, and some of them also came from Baltimore, other sisters. Government supplies began to arrive to supplement what the sisters had been able to provide. For as long as there were wounded, the sisters nursed the soldiers and comforted and baptized the dying of both armies. That is one of the sisters, one of the few photographs that I've seen, Sister Camelia O'Keefe. Now, I have been working on this program, PowerPoint program, and I had talked to licensed battlefield guide Deb Novotny about it, and she said, did you know there is a woman mentioned on the monument on Little Round Top in the castle? And I said, really? She said, yes, Harriet Weld Corning. So we'll get into that as we continue. In addition to the various plaques in there that mention not only individual officers and lower ranking soldiers, they also list on those plaques commissary sergeants, hospital stewards, band members, sutlers, and one woman nurse, Laura A. Hudson Bissell. There's a bigger plaque to the right that says Harriet Weld Corning. She was the patron for the regiment, paid for the flags, regimental flags and the U.S. flags, etc. And that's why her plaque is there. That's the one that she knew about. But as I was studying all of those plaques, I saw in the far right corner the one about Laura Hudson Bissell. And I talked to Deb Novotny afterward when I went up there to take pictures for this program. I said, you know, there's 2 women in there. And she said, no. I said, yeah. And I told her. And she was a former school teacher. She said, you get an A+. So there's Laura A. Hudson Bissell, the daughter of a Baptist clergyman born near Albany, New York. She became a school teacher and wrote the words to the song Ellsworth Avengers to honor Colonel Elmer Ellsworth of the 11th New York Infantry, the first Union officer killed in the Civil War in May of '61. When members of the 44th New York Infantry learned of the song, they called upon her and asked permission to adopt the words of the regimental song. And then they invited her to accompany them as the nurse of the regiment. She did so and joined the regiment as a volunteer, later marrying Dr. Elias Bissell, assistant surgeon of the 44th New York. And there's the far bottom plaque inside the monument. Laura A. Hudson Bissell, second line from the bottom. This is the one that is more well known because it is much larger and it is just to the left of the entrance to the stairway to go up to the platform on the castle monument. So you can't miss it. Harriet Weld Corning was a member of the Weld family of Roxbury, Massachusetts, married Erastus Corning, businessman from Connecticut, and other businesses which he set up in and near Albany, New York. Got involved in state politics. Inside the plaque, it says, as a tribute to a patriotic woman, Mrs. Harriet Weld Corning, who presented the 44th Regiment the colors under which it fought. And there's a painting of Mrs. Harriet Weld Corning on the right. Now, this is thanks to Andrea. I added this week with her review, approval, and assistance. We know about General Barlow, and we know he gets wounded supposedly mortally on July 1st near Blocker's Knoll, which becomes Barlow's Knoll. I don't know if everybody remembers it. His wife, Arabella, who became a nurse and helped serve with her husband as a nurse and then with the U.S. Sanitary Commission after he joined the 12th Regiment of the New York State Militia. She joined in 62. He joined in 1861 of April of 61. And he's wounded, Battle of Antietam, wounded by an artillery shell in the face and by a grape shot in the groin. Arabella was serving at that time with the Sanitary Commission in Baltimore, who learned of the fighting and his wounding and got to the battlefield in Antietam that same day. He recovered thanks to her. She helped him in a military hospital and then in a private room that she had arranged. It took several months for him to recover, which makes sense considering his wounds. And he did not return to active duty until spring of 63. But history repeated itself at the Battle of Gettysburg, where Barlow again is wounded, this time hit in the left side, about halfway between the armpit and the thigh bone. For whatever reasons, with those types of wounds, the Confederate surgeons deemed his wounds mortal. And later, a Union surgeon that had been captured with him also deemed the wounds mortal. He was first taken to the Josiah Benner house nearby, and then ended up going on July 2nd, after they deemed his wounds mortal, to the John Crawford house on the northeastern edge of town. While there, some of General Ewell's and General Early's staff came to see him, and Ewell and Early sent words through the lines under a flag of truce to Arabella, who was near the battlefield with the Sanitary Commission. The Confederates granted her permission to attend her husband, and although the details are unclear as to when she actually got to her husband, several Gettysburg civilians reportedly saw her on horseback being escorted by Confederate soldiers on the night of July 2nd. Again, Arabella slowly nursed him back to health. He returned to active duty in April 64 and ultimately survived the war. Unfortunately, that would not be the case for Arabella. She died on July 27, 1864, during the siege of Petersburg of typhus, a bacterial disease spread by fleas and lice. A sad end. Now, this is my favorite woman at Gettysburg. My great-great-grandfather Felix was a private in Company A, 12th U.S. Infantry. He was from Ohio, enlisted in the U.S. regulars, and fought on July 2nd during the battle for the wheat field. He was shot through both legs, did not lose the legs, taken to a field hospital, possibly the Jacob Weichert farm. He might have run into Tilly Pierce, and then probably to Camp Letterman before convalescing in a home in Littlestown. Although a native of Columbus, Ohio, as I mentioned, he returned in 64 to Gettysburg and married the lady who took care of him. Her name was Laura Will. By 1883, she had become homesick for Gettysburg and convinced Felix to move back to Gettysburg in Adams County. And they purchased the 178-acre farm known as Granite Hill Campground outside of Fairfield. That was our homestead. They raised 9 children, 2 daughters, 7 sons. When Felix was too old to run the farm, he offered it to his sons, and they apparently had had enough of farming. They gave it to the one daughter. That's how it got out of my family name. It still stands today, the house and the farm. It's a bed and breakfast. I've been inside. When he got rid of the farm and gave it to his one daughter. He built his own house on Springs Avenue. It was sort of like a Sears catalog house and it still stands there today. It was for sale about 15 years ago. I talked to the realtor who took me inside the house. On the one wall was the one photograph you're about to see. And on the wall above the door frames, there was the Maltese cross symbol, which was the Fifth Court, which she did not know. She was a realtor and she ended up buying the house. And she has maintained the house and kept the house and its history alive. That's a photograph at the campground. That's Felix, my great-great-grandfather who was wounded. That's my great-grandfather, Harry. And that is Laura Will. That is the house on Springs Avenue. That's him at the bottom right corner. She is to his right, it appears. I like the little outhouse in the back. And there's a somewhat of a colorized version. And that's a better view of it today. I hope you enjoyed the program. Again, I did not and could not cover everybody, but I tried to give you a wide gamut of some of the stories that you may or may not already know.